The European Union is a difficult issue for us, but it's also a critical one. And effectively, unless it's grasped, or we get the trade union movement to grasp it, many of the things that we've been arguing for in the People's Charter or the alternative political and economic strategy are just not credible, because people know that ultimately they will be illegal in terms of the European Union. And that may well be why the TUC leadership are happy enough to see the People's Charter go through and happy enough to see the AEPS go through, because they know as long as the European Union is there and its rules and regulations, they mean very little. Just to go through what we've managed to get the TUC congresses to carry through over the last 5 years, you can see in a sense, or 4 years, see how difficult it's been. 2008, 2007, there were motions of opposition to the Lisbon Treaty, but there was no campaign. There should have been a campaign. There was no campaign. 2009, there was a good resolution on the Posted Workers Directive. This was after the great strikes that took place at the power stations in the Yorkshire area about the rights of workers being brought in, shipped in from outside, and their right to have equal pay. But the actual resolution itself simply said the government should seek to modify that regulation, that directive. So not much there. 2010, simply support for an ETUC demonstration on pensions, no more than that. 2011, opposition to the Mode 4 free trade agreement with India and with the TUC to campaign to publicise the issues. The TUC didn't campaign to publicise the issues, it said it was too difficult. Nobody knew what Mode 4 was, or what Mode 5 was, or Mode 1 was, or where they came from. So, too difficult to publicise them. And obviously nobody knows where they come from now because nobody's publicised it. So, that wasn't carried through. So, I just want to pose a question, and I know that's always difficult for time, but just take 3 people coming in from the floor. Why has it been so difficult to get the issue of the EU as a whole raised in the trade union movement, and in particular that issue that we're raising in the Needs of the Hour this year, which is withdrawal? Why has it been so difficult? So, who wants to volunteer? Rob and Rod and Steve. Rob, but very quickly.
Yeah, sorry. I think there's a guilt feeling on a lot of the people that consider themselves left, including, sad to say, even within our own party. They feel guilty about raising this issue because they see it as nationalism. And certainly, although we may have an influence in the Socialist Party, the majority of the sort of Trotskyist factions actually attack us, on this issue because they want to preserve their internationalism.
Yeah. Thanks. Rod, next.
There's an excellent article in Morning Star talking about the addiction of the TUC to the social chapter and the belief in the social chapter, and that's been extremely damaging. However, it, in my opinion, wouldn't be right not to be objective about it. The anti-union ECJ, the European Court of Justice, which has passed the Viking stuff and all that stuff and the India stuff about bringing in workers at rates from their own country, which would cause chaos, is opposed by the European Court of Human Rights, which sometimes does arrive at reasonably progressive judgments. So it's slightly complicated, but it still stands that the social justice dream from a united Europe has brainwashed a lot of people.
Yeah, I'll come back on that one. I actually saw Steve and I said 3, so I think we'll actually limit it to that.
Well, I think it's also, like as Rob said, this worry about being seen as being nationalist, but also the fact that because some Tory MPs are identified with opposition to the EU, it's not, a lot of people just don't want to deal with it, don't want to touch it really, and now, I mean, the reality is there isn't a single issue you can name that won't have some Tory MPs who might take a contradictory position to other MPs on that. And there's also this belief, don't want to blame it all on Billy Bragg, but for a lot of young people, there's this idea that the EU is progressive because you've got someone who, like Billy Bragg, who's genuinely progressive, who seems to think it's a good thing, and who's always praising it at every opportunity. But he hasn't been doing it so much recently, so maybe we'll see
Yeah. I think that has actually summed up why it is so difficult. First of all, chauvinism. It's associated with chauvinism or nationalism. People don't like that, quite correctly. Secondly, there is the legacy of Jacques Delors and the social chapter. Although I should just point on Rod's point about the European Court of Human Rights, which is under immense attack at the moment from the Tory government. That is, of course, nothing to do with the European Union, contradicts European judgments quite often, and was set up under the Convention of Europe and is responsible to that body. So it is, in fact, based upon a convention signed at a time when the socialist countries of Eastern Europe were members of that body. And therefore it has things in it like the right to employment. The EU Charter of Fundamental Rights simply has something rather different, the right to seek employment. So if you look at that convention, the rights are far more fundamental, and they're social and economic rights, and they must be defended. And that's, of course, why our Tory government is going after them. But the social chapter, nonetheless, TUPE, the Working Hours Directive, a certain amount of gender equality legislation, although the best comes from the European Court of Human Rights, and finally, the fact that the Tories are, in part at least, again it, and we'll come back to that. But that is also, I think, quite powerful. People don't like associating themselves with Tories for good reasons. But maybe in certain circumstances we have to associate with some of them. I won't take your point because I said just three, and I'm going to be quite hard with it because otherwise we won't get through. There will be lots of chances of coming in later. I just want to do a bit of talking, and then we'll come back to some more participation, and then we'll break into groups as said in the programme. I want to just say where we are with the current position in terms of the European Union, this crisis that's been unfolding. The draft, what's called Stability Treaty, was agreed by all heads of state on the 30th of January, except the United Kingdom and the Czech Republic. Cameron did, however, say that he would not oppose that stability treaty using EU institutions, in particular the European Central Bank and the European Court of Justice, to enforce and administer its decisions. So he stood back the position he'd taken in December. Quite what he got in return, we don't know. These things are not said publicly. He may have got some kind of assurances about the financial transaction tax and the protection of the interests of the City of London. What, however, Cameron has managed to do by not making Britain a signatory to that act is to avoid a referendum. And that was a crucial objective of his in December. Because he knows that if you had a referendum, it would be defeated in Britain, but more fatal than that, the Lib Dem coalition would be split and there would be a massive revolt within the Tory party. He's managed so far to avoid that. So he has played this fairly cleverly. He has gestured to the anti-EU lobby in the Conservative Party that he is quizzical about the EU, if not sceptical. He has tried to direct the fire against the European Court of Human Rights rather than the EU in the last period, and he has managed to avoid a referendum. And he may have got something back for the City of London, but we don't know that. It'll emerge in due course. The treaty that has been passed is the most savagely deflationary treaty imaginable. I think some people have compared it to the Treaty of Versailles in terms of its long run disastrous effects on the European economy and on war and peace. I think somebody wrote a pamphlet called about the economic consequences of the Treaty of Versailles, and that had proved to be true in the end. It will be ratified in March and come into force on the January of next year. It says the borrowing limit for any country must be no more than 0.5% in any 1 year over a cycle. Previously, it was 3%. Worse than that, it says all countries with a national debt over 60% of GDP must reduce it by 5% a year until it gets down to 60%. That means cutting expenditure by that amount, more or less, 4%, 3%, depending on just how high it is, and a percentage of the GDP into the future. An immensely deflationary act.
So what's the limit?
Sorry?
What's the limit?
Well, the limit is that you've got to bring it down to 60%. In most countries in Europe, I think virtually every country, it is over 60%. Even in Germany, it's 73%. I think Britain is slightly less than that. But in countries like Spain or Greece, it's up 100%, 120%. I think in Ireland it's 140%. So you've got to reduce it every year by 5%, your public expenditure. So that is a massive cut. All countries must in future submit their budgets to the EU Commission prior to them being put to Parliament. All debtor countries must surrender complete control over tax, spending and all legislation concerning conditions of employment to the EU Commission, the European Central Bank, to control. So that's every country that is in receipt of bailout funds. The description of it by the European Party of the Left, which is not the most radical of the groups in Parliament, you could say that's the Portuguese, they call it regime change towards the dictatorship of the markets. That's a fairly strong but I think very effective phrase. Regime change towards dictatorship of the markets. And as a result of that treaty being signed, at least in outline, the European Central Bank has begun to inject cash into the system, quantitative easing. We've heard about that from Rob. It goes to the banks, it doesn't go to governments, and the banks are then meant to buy bonds from governments. It will result in speculation, inflation, and through that it will redistribute income from the poor to the rich. Above all, in mass unemployment, that is what it's bound to do, because workers will not have the bargaining power to push up their wages in step with inflation. So, that's where we are. The treaty's got through. It provides a solution for Franco-German state monopoly capitalism. It stabilizes a base for their advance, at least temporarily, but it supplies no solution whatsoever to the systemic crisis of the Eurozone. That continues with mass unemployment and stagnation, and the disparities will get worse. I've distributed a briefing sheet looking at some of the origins of it. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but just say a little bit about that crisis. It's important that we are able to explain it to our comrades inside the trade union and labour movement. What the currency union did from 1999 was bring together immensely powerful, dominant industrial countries like Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, and to a lesser extent France, with very weak economies in the Mediterranean periphery, like Greece, Portugal, and to a lesser extent Spain and Italy. That generated a situation where their markets were taken over by the big industrial powers, and you can look at the statistics. It's quite remarkable, in fact, the degree to which the disparities occurred. The balance of trade went massively in favour of Germany and to a lesser extent these other countries, running up deficits which could only be made up by the supply of credit. And so the banks from Germany and France and Britain supplied the credit to banks in Greece and Portugal and Spain and Italy, which made up the purchasing power that they lost because of the imbalance of trade. And that was fine. It went on for 10 years until the crash of 2008. And then that easy credit came to an end, and the banks in those countries were not able to pay back the money at all. They were broke, they were bankrupt. And what happens then? The European Central Bank goes to the government, and we know it did, in Ireland and in Greece and in Spain, and it says, you have got to honour these debts. You, the government, has got to take over the debts of this private sector, of the banks. And they did. And that worked for a year and a half. And then, because there was recession, GDPs contracted, there was mass unemployment, people couldn't pay taxes, didn't pay them anymore if they were unemployed. And then the governments were seen to be in debt, verging on bankruptcy. So now the ECB and the European Commission says to these governments, we are going to take control of you. And that is where we are. It's a totally undemocratic process that has now been rubber-stamped by this treaty, whereby basically the dominant monopoly powers of Europe have abrogated the democracy of the other countries that are debtors. What's Britain's position? Well, Britain has got a very special position in relationship, and always has, to the European Union. And it's largely linked to Britain's close alliance with the United States of America, and above all with the United States of America's banks. That alliance has gone on for a long time. It's one of the reasons why de Gaulle didn't want Britain in the European Union or common market as it was then. It was intensified in the 1980s as a result of the economic policies of the Thatcher government, which relied upon bringing American banks into the City of London, developing that as a centre for dollar transactions within Europe, and penetrating the hitherto closed financial banking markets of the member countries of the European Union. And it was for that purpose that it was Thatcher who pushed through the European Single Act. There were other people who had interests in it in terms of monopoly capital in Germany and France. But the main drive at that point in 1986 came from the British, from Thatcher. It was to enable the opening of those markets. And of course, within the City of London itself, American banks are the dominant banks now. They supply something like 2/3 of all the capital. They are the ones who generate the major transactions. It's not British banks. All the merchant banks have been taken over, and the major investment banks are American. So Britain operates as the agent, in a sense, of those American banks. It does very well out of the various trades that are involved, but that's the way it sees itself going forward. But the quid pro quo for the City of London's expansion is rigid adherence to that single European Act and all the prohibitions on any form of state interference or closure of markets. And the consequence of this has been the annihilation of Britain's manufacturing industry. Well, this is standard economics. I won't go on too long about it. But that is continuingly why Britain wants to be in the European Union, and is why Cameron says he defends the single market. He defends it for the interests of the City of London, but there remains a contradiction, because Cameron's base, the Conservative Party's base, is among small business. If you go to any of the areas of the country, those are the people who make up the mass base of the Conservative Party. Those are the people they rely upon to get out their votes. And small business depends upon industry of some kind or other. And it feels that pinch. And so you've got in that base extreme concern about the European Union. And there is the other aspect of the Conservative Party, the fact that the Conservative Party's base ideology is nationalist, you could probably say chauvinist. And consequently, this link with the European Union also causes a problem for the base ideology of the party. So those two factors together create a level of instability within the Conservatives that we should be aware of and try and exploit. Now, we have to think very carefully, and this is maybe a subject for discussion, maybe not here, but somewhere, about how we do align ourselves to those divisions. Currently, insofar as there is a mass movement against the European Union in Britain, it is made up precisely of those kind of people. The trade union element is very, very weak, very weak. That was seen at that People's Pledge conference 2 or 3 months ago, which I think I and 2 or 3 others in this audience attended. It was overwhelmingly conservative. Now, what should our attitude be to these people? I think the first thing to be said is that we are only going to be able to have any leverage when the trade union and labour movement takes a position on the European Union. But secondly, there are elements in the opposition to the European Union, even within the Conservative Party, that has a democratic content to it, as long as there is an explanation of what that democracy is about, and that can only come from the trade union and labour movement. That's why it is so important that we do try and make some progress on the needs of the hour. Finally, just a characterization of the European Union that I think it's important that we try and make. What is it? What kind of an organization is it? I think we have to say it is an imperialist organization, but with its own internal inter-imperialist contradictions, and also now its own internal colonies. That's a phrase that Lenin used to describe parts of the Russian Empire in the 1890s and 1900s. Its own internal colonies. You can't, I think, express the relationship with Greece or Ireland any other than a colonial relationship now. There are within it centres of state monopoly capitalist power that stand on their own and represent discrete capitalist classes. Saw that in the banking crisis. It was handled specifically by the French government, the British government, the Belgian government, the Dutch government. Each rescued its banks. So they are centres of state monopoly capitalist power, and naturally, as such, they have contradictory interests to the other centres. The biggest of those contradictions is between Britain and its United States financial allies and Germany and France. And that is, I suspect, going to become much more visible over the next 5 to 10 years. But there are also tensions, as we've seen in the last 6 months, between Germany and France. There is, at the same time as these contradictions, an overlying additional common interest of imperialists, and that is in suppressing democracy across Europe. and suppressing the possibility of any non-neoliberal alternative economic strategy emerging. That has been one key essence within the European Union since its origin, and has become strengthened at each stage in the development of the European Union. That anti-democratic content. Europe is a continent, because of its history, in which there are strong social democratic communist movements which achieved immense gains for working people in the post-war period, and which for 70 years was the interface with socialist countries. And the fact that we've got this European Court of Human Rights with the kind of rights that are in it is partly a result of that. That is a legacy which monopoly capital in Europe wants to squeeze out. And it wants to squeeze out the democracy, relatively new in the member parliaments of the European Union. So there is a common interest on that front. We have to put forward our alternative, popular sovereignty, and we have to be able to explain what we mean by that popular sovereignty as part of a popular, democratic, anti-monopoly alliance to achieve a majority of the population in terms of parliamentary representation that will be able to determine how the economy is run in the interests of people and not of capital. Not immediately as socialist, but holding the potential of moving forward to socialism, and not just the potential, but it would be the necessity of moving forward once you have started to challenge monopoly capitalist power. So we need to be able to explain popular sovereignty, and we also need to be able to explain that in our position on the European Union, we are not chauvinist, we are defending democracy, we are defending the people, and we are doing so on the basis of internationalism. Internationalism within Europe and internationalism beyond Europe. One thing that I haven't said, and it's not in the briefing sheets at all, is anything about the near-European space and the various interventions made by the European Union in an increasingly coherent and military fashion over the last 5 years. In Africa, and as we've seen in the last year in Libya, and now in Syria, and in Iran as well. So we are fighting here not just on a democratic front, but also on an internationalist front. I think that is more or less what I wanted to say by way of starting discussion. I've distributed these briefing sheets. One is simply on dates, so you've got the dates in front of you. The second is on privatization, showing where all the privatizations came from. The third is on the attack on employment rights stemming from the 2000 Lisbon program. That is probably the one that's most worth studying and is the one that's least known about. The degree to which, under that Lisbon strategy of 2000, renewed by the 2005 program, and then in 2010 changed into the Europe 2020 program, governments are obliged annually now, previously at every third year, to report what they were doing to achieve the objectives of securing competitiveness in production, including timetables from 2000 onwards for increasing the pension age, or as they put it, ending early labour movement exit. You have to look at the language of these things to believe it. For increasing the flexibility of employment contracts. The philosophy of these programs is that what's causing unemployment is the fact that employers are frightened of employing people because they won't be able to sack them 6 months down the line. If they had that chance, then they take everybody into their books and be able to sack them 6 months down the line. So necessarily you need to end the type of employment contracts that exist across the European Union. I won't go into the detail, but it's worth looking at that and looking at the British government responses, all of which are available on the net if you want to go and look at them, and you know where to look. I've given some of the references there. They are, in many ways, a revelation. Then there's the European Courts of Justice cases, which I think everybody knows about, and the climate crisis. So that's briefing material. As I've said, it doesn't say anything about the external imperialist character of the European Union and what it's doing in terms of its so-called free trade agreements with other countries across Europe, the Caribbean, and in Asia. But those again are available, I think, on various websites if you want to find them. So let's just now go on to, it's 4 o'clock. I've been speaking for about 30 minutes, which is too long. Well, all right. Well, anyway, I'm going to shut up. I'm going to give you time to come back. I did give you some homework to do, I think, and that was give 3 points that you would put into a speech at a union conference if you were going to argue for withdrawal. Most union speeches, I think you're very lucky to get time for 2 points, and I'd ask you to be extremely brief in giving those responses, but I think it would be very interesting to know the points that people will think to be the killer points to get over in a conference speech, or even more important probably in a union branch speech where you've got slightly more time, but you don't have more time here. So who's going to come in first? Anita.
Yeah. The reason I'm starting is because I'm a member of a union that actually has members in 5 or 6 member states of the European Union. Many of you may have members in both the United Kingdom and the whole of the island of Ireland. So that my speech, and I think the speeches do have to be industry specific, so the points I would make quite clearly, if we're talking about Levison, the time of Levison, would be on the failure of the EU to tackle cross-media ownership and limits on both media ownership and cross-media ownership. The argument about national sovereignty is quite easily won because Mr. Murdoch couldn't even apply to take shares in B-Sky B here until he'd been cleared in the EU. But he had to go through part of that position. And the third one is that in a industry generally, but in journalism particularly, where you have lots of atypical workers, where there are quite a lot of freelancers, particularly the definition of competitiveness, which is actually increasing monopolisation, means that, particularly in Ireland, as it so happens, John, many of our freelance members get the need to be competitive in EU terms is exactly against the traditions of the way our freelance members work collectively, even though they work individually. So that, I thought, would be a good example of why, much as we would like to do the top thumping, that's a different argument, but to win it, you have to address your audience, and therefore it has to be very industry specific. And you've never won it.
So that I think is a very good point that everybody should, in fact, take note of. Kevin.
Kevin Donnelly, Unite in Leeds Straits Council. Just turning it slightly different actually. I had my branch meeting yesterday, and I just got your paper and I thought, you know, I'm going to go in and actually try some of this out. Use this. I'm the branch secretary, so I can do what I like. So they have to sit and listen to me. And I actually started off with the popular sovereignty thing. I actually asked the branch what they thought popular sovereignty was, and it was incredibly difficult. It was difficult trying to explain it in a way that made it different from what we've got, because people are so ideologically blinkered, thinking that what we've got is actually a good thing. So it was difficult trying to say what is different about it, but also cutting out the jargon. Once they started throwing in anti-monopoly, it just opened up the debate even more. And one way I got round to this is because, I suppose because of the work I do, because I'm a youth and community worker, I like telling stories. And there was a story, a Spanish writer a guy called Borges, I think. I'm trying to think his name, but there's a story about the Congress, and it's basically a short story about basically they call a World Congress. They decide to have a World Congress, and there's this absurd debate that goes on in it with the lead character, because the lead character says, well, okay, who am I representing in this Congress? Am I representing people with beards? Am I representing people who are Uruguayan? Am I representing housewives? And the whole point of this is that basically the only Congress that can represent the world is the world itself. So it was all about trying to get the idea about what popular meant, what popular sovereignty meant. And actually at the end of the debate, somebody was actually saying, you know, you're right, we're actually held hostage by the present system. We're all hostages to fortune. So the message was getting there, but it was a difficult, very difficult to explain, really, in terms of, I didn't get on to the 3 points. I was supposed to, I did have a big debate about it, but just to warn you, it's not an easy one.
Lots of hands now. I think did I see Bill next or not? No, he is fiddling with his collar. Okay.
Inevitably, I will look at employment law for my 3 points, or at least 2 of them. And I think employment law would help in 2 ways. One, to bury the law, and that mirage that it's Europe is providing all the rights that has saved us. It might have saved us in days of Thatcher when we were getting bashed and there was nothing else, and it looked like Europe was offering things. It's certainly not offering things anymore. In fact, it's turning the clock back. There is a document that you referred to called Modernising Labour Law for the 21st Century, which sets the tone of where Europe is going. And basically what that does is it turns labour law on its head. We know that labour law was first introduced to try and rebalance the workplace because employers have got all the power and workers haven't. So employment law was there to protect you. That ideology is completely turned on its head with the European document, in that it's not rebalancing power between the employer and the worker, it's rebalancing power between the weak worker and the possibly stronger worker, and that ideology is feeding through into everything. Now, for instance, in the pensions debate, you know, the argument is, well, the public sector shouldn't have all these wonderful pensions because the private sector haven't got any. And it's that kind of balancing down instead of balancing up is what they're going for. So, and you know, you touched on it in terms of flexibility. Those with permanent, secure, maybe organised jobs are supposed to give it up because there's a whole load of youth people out there who can't get a job at all, and it's because you're all hanging on to your jobs with security. So it completely turns it around. So I'd use labour law as a basis for the discussion. And the other one would be procurement and contract compliance. One of the things that the labour movement used to use was contract compliance. The money that is spent by, we're going into a period now, they say, of rebalancing the economy, where even the Tories are saying we need some kind of manufacturing or some kind of whatever. That money can't go straight into the pockets of private businesses and private multinationals. There has to be a way that we use procurement and contract compliance that says you've got to have good labour standards, you've got to recognise a union. That would be where we want the money to go in the future. The argument is that Europe won't allow that. And I think if we are if we're wanting to defend jobs and we're wanting to promote a rebalanced economy, then we have to point it out that Europe is once again hindering rather than helping our progress. That's 2 points. I'll leave the third to someone else.
I've seen hands over there. I better come to them.
Thanks. I'm quoting from an excellent pamphlet by late comrade Gordon McLennan before he was the shield and protector of anti-communism within the Communist Party. Quit the market, join the world. Harold Wilson, leader of the Labour Party, opposing the decision to take us into the common market by Edward Heath. He said in January 1973, in 93 legislative words, the safeguards gained after centuries of constitutional struggle and even bloody civil war were swept aside by a provision that said simply that hereafter anything enacted by the EEC automatically becomes British law, annulling any laws which were inconsistent without debate. That's a very good quote, still true. They make the laws. The whole point is to bypass democracy. That's what it's all about. He also said the EEC is a Magna Carta for the barons of the multinational mega corporations. It's proved all true. Tony Blair told the Financial Times in 2004 that one of the great merits of international institutions such as the EU was that they facilitated economic reforms which it would be difficult for politicians to take through their own national parliaments. How convenient and how true. And then just a few weeks ago, I think it was, Lord Mandelson said that we're coming to the end of or he said the era of pure representative democracy is coming to an end. Nice of him to let us know. That's what it's all about. It's a system of bypassing democracy, making it possible for laws to be passed without the inconvenience of having to put them in anybody's election manifesto. That's the answer to the question of popular sovereignty.
Phil, and then I think
I think in terms of the
Phil, not Phil. I was going to take some more over on that side, and then I'll come back onto this side, and then we'll call it. We got another section. So Phil.
I think people like history
Most.
and they appreciate consistency. So my arguments would be rooted in history. The first one being that for decades the trade unions and indeed the Labour Party opposed the EEC. Many young people these days would be surprised. And when they say that you are a dinosaur for opposing something that looks so progressive, you can take that out by saying, well, actually, there's been a very different view of it in the past, and therefore there can be a very different view of it in the future. Second point of history. Between 1940 and 1943, Mosley was in prison. They've just released the tapes of his bugged conversations in Holloway. It was an open prison. He was asked, what's the future? He said, there's no future in fascism. You have to find something else to call upon. And spent the next 20 years of his life campaigning for what he called a white Europe against Russia and China, based on the model of the Italian corporate state. I think the Greeks today could tell you all about that. So there's a historical route to these things that are now being played out. Finally, 1945. We've all been brought up in a certain way. We think that borders have always been and always will be, but that's not true. One of the things that unites the forces in the EU is a wish to redraw the boundaries and borders that were agreed by 1945. Poland, by the way, has never recognised its borders to the east. And there's now emerging within the EU, allied with the British Conservative Party, especially in places like Hungary and Lithuania, possibly at the level of taking over the government of their countries, forces which do not accept the way that borders were divided when the Soviet Union was in place, and therefore see in the EU an opportunity to redraw those borders. The final word goes to Robin Cook, who was asked, why is Britain at war with countries in the Balkans? To which he replied, when you joined the EU, you signed up to the European Union, a foreign and, foreign treaty, I've got it here, foreign and security treaty. And therefore, what goes on in the Balkans is effectively your problem, because you've signed up to that. Therefore, their borders are your borders. You asked the question, how do we relate to these other forces? I don't call them right-wing forces necessarily. It's too easy to label people in that way. There are a lot of progressive small business people as well, and a lot especially that lived hand to mouth as small business people in the farms and fishing industry. And I think that if we dwell on economic questions when we sit down and relate to people in the People's Pledge campaign, we're going to have division. We should focus on the one key issue, which is sovereignty. That's the freedom of the people. And that way, you can have the other debates out and you can battle it out in your class struggle. But the key issue is whether or not you can make decisions to run your own country. And in that, most people should be able to sign up.
Thanks, Phil. I think it was David.
I think the points I'd sort of concentrate is growth and stability pact, 3% limit on deficit budget, which I believe was one of the drivers for PFI schemes. Often put
Yep.
accounting for various things. It's over 200 billion in projects, something like 60 to 70 billion for hospitals, which is now having a devastating impact on finances and ward closures and service cuts in the health service. The Health Services Directive, which has allowed health tourism, allowing people to go abroad and forcing the home country's health service to top up the rent, which means that women go abroad to dodgy Eastern European clinics and then end up with complications between the health service here has to rectify at our cost. And probably the European arrest warrant making it much easier to extradite people around Europe.
Yeah. Thanks very much. I think it was Moz. Well, I've got Bill and then I'll come back to yourself, Kevin.
One speech that was made was based on how come we are just voting to support motions that call for the maintenance of public services, investment in public services, and yet you want to support the single currency, which is in direct contradiction. Obviously, add more. And that was taken from that point to a motion to conference. And it was the motion to conference and conference recognising those links that led to that. Now, since that time, there's been a much watering down of that position, and Unison is totally it can have very long motions on its conference that run over 2 A4 pages on Europe, but the basis of that is that they sign up to the social chapter. So in order to break that belief down that the social chapter is our safeguard and all that we need to concentrate on, a bit like CAD really, I'm a very practical sort of person. So the issues that are smacking me in the face in local government are issues about pensions, privatisation and attacks on terms and conditions. So from my point of view, the sense for me is to pick the issues that people that I work with relate to every day, and to use, John, your very excellent briefing, because I've just got every small area and a sentence that you can attach to it that gives you prime examples of how that attack is taking place. And the sorts of things that I can use are the quotes that are in the pensions pamphlet on the pensions issue that show where the attack is coming from. In terms of privatisation, all the references you've made about the improving flexibility of the employer's contracts, you can give concrete examples of that. You know, it's only last week, or possibly the week before, that the announcement on teachers has been made about the 12-week moving teachers out instead of going through a much shortened process. We've got academies in Derby that are saying rather than transfer employees from local authority to academies, rather than tupiing them, they're going to dismiss and re-engage them, so they don't have to apply any of the terms and conditions. What is one of the planks of this government's attack? Doing away with tupi. Not that tupi is also the be all and end all. It did have its uses. So all those sorts of issues on a practical basis, I think, are the ones that can be used at a local level wherever you are. There's lots of areas you could use, but it has to relate to where you are, because that's where you're strong and that's what other people identify with.
Bill, Liz, then Kevin, and I'm going to have to then, I think, draw it to a close, because there's another question that was posed for this session, which was, what is the position, in particular, unions? And we'll, I think, hold it off for that. We've got partly a reply to that one already.
John, but before you do, can we have some heating turned on? Because we're becoming icicles at this time.
We can, it's very loud.
I know it is, but...
So everyone's got
Please, the
over
here.
All right, we'll break into small groups in a minute anyway, so that will enable people to circulate. Bill, I think is next.
When we break into small groups, maybe we should come back and sit in different parts of the room. NUT, public service, and non-profit making in education is outside of EU proposals. I think that one of the big things as well is the question of social inequality, which is masquerade. There's the masquerade of the social chapter was intended to do away with that, but clearly all the issues that you've raised, John, show a general increase in social inequality, which has a direct impact on educational achievement. So those things as well.
Thanks, Bill. And I think it was it Liz, and then it was Kevin. I may have Liz.
Yeah, Liz Payne, Unison. I would want to be arguing along the lines of the privatisation of the public sector, actually with any public sector unions, and that Europe has actually got a very, very strong policy to privatise whatever it possibly can, wherever it can, and to make the maximum profit out of those privatised services for monopoly capitalists across Europe. And I can't see any reason why people who work in the public sector would not find that a very, very powerful argument. And the second one would be, along the same lines, the incredibly close connection between the European Union and NATO and the military-industrial complexes. And that takes our jobs and our services and everything. Everything that takes away from people and puts into private profit is in that argument.
Kevin?
I'd like to know what anybody's experience is when they moved at the branch. I've got a progressive branch. The same branch meet that I moved, we should give some money to the store, and they agreed 500 quid. The same branch meet, I moved that we put a motion to my conference to come out the European Union. Strengthen it by what happened in manufacturing, in Metcam, Bombardier, etc. Strengthen it on the cuts, and I'm in the chair, I moved from the chair. We had 2 or 3 speakers against. If we came out of the common market, we wouldn't be able to trade with Europe, etc., etc. Put it to the vote, massive abstentions, some against, and I lost it. But even made it worse, I lost it, they were drinking my Cuban rum that I brought back. But nevertheless, I lost it. Now, I mean, I can usually move things and get them through that branch. I couldn't get that. I just wondered what other people's experience was. You know, a simple cry, well, if we don't, we're not in Europe, we'll not be able to trade with them. Just went on deaf ears.
Okay. Well, I can see other hands. I think we... Sorry.
Pure question.
All right, a question.
And it relates directly to this. You said that the UK or Britain operates as an agent of the US banks in the European Union. And then you said that this has led to the annihilation of British industry in relation to Kevin's experience there. I don't understand how that happens. Is it possible to explain how that alliance has a massive negative effect on British industry?
I think that's a crucial point. Just to comment on the responses. First of all, we didn't get Tommy coming in. He's the one person who's moved a whole series of resolutions at the STUC that always get passed on the issue of the European Union. The last one last year, without distributing bottles of Cuban rum as well. And the last one actually commanded that the General Council examine alternatives to the European Union in light of its conflict with all aspects of the alternative economic and political strategy. That was the essence of it, which has now got a report on what it's done to be able to find the alternative to the European Union. So, Tom, maybe it would have been good to come in on that. The other point that I was going to come in, it meshed with what Kevin had said. Nobody has said what the alternative is. I think probably that is something, and that's why it's one of the questions that you're going to look at in the small groups. We have to say what is the alternative we will be putting forward specifically. Otherwise, withdrawal really will be always answered, well, what is your alternative? And unless you've got it there in your 3 points, you'll lose. But I think the comrade over here is, again, quite right to say that we haven't made explicit. I think it's a bit more explicit in the pamphlet of the European Union about quite how it is that the decimation of Britain's industrial infrastructure and of its industry has taken place as a result of this devil's pact with the European Union on financial services. Britain has adhered to European Union rules with a stringency that no other country has for that purpose, and those rules say that there must be no interference with free competition by any form of state aid to industry. So, on the one hand, there has never been any attempt to aid plants like Bombardier, and you can go back to a whole list of them right back. I'm going to be speaking a meeting next week about Caterpillar. Remember the occupation of the Caterpillar plant? 25 years ago. Any attempt by the government to bail that out? Illegal under the rules of the European Union. That on the one side, and then the productive infrastructure of the utilities, again, that has to be privatized or opened up to competition, and in doing so, again, there has been massive losses in a whole number of different ways to productive potential of what had previously been a public sector, which could have been the basis for regeneration in, say, energy. So that, I think, is the, well, that answers it, does it?
But what about the US factor?
Well, what's the link?
Yeah.
Well, the link is simply that in 1980, there were discussions between the British government and the American government at the time of the ending of all capital controls by the British government and similar ending of controls over their export of capital by the American government. That gave the ability of the City of London to become what is effectively a tax haven for American banks. And that was strengthened still further by what's called the Big Bang, which I think was 1985, which was when it became legal for investment banks to trade directly in shares on the stock exchange, which they hadn't been allowed to do before.
So would this be correct, that the special privileges that the US banks have in Britain are allowed by the strict adherence of the UK government to open everything up to competition, to have a prime injection into British privatisation? Would that be correct?
Well, their key interest was not just Britain, it was into Europe. And the Single European Act of 1986 was negotiated as a result of these discussions about the new role of the City of London. That can be documented.
So it's their conduit into the whole of the
yes,
Union.
I mean, the British market was important, but the key objective was to get into the EU market. So we don't kind of wander too far away from where we should be. Let's go on now just to a very quick response.
Just ask one question.
All right.
If you follow Sinn Féin politics, you see reports of Green Left European alliance within the European Union. I think it's something like NUE/FL.
Yeah.
I think Communist Party led the re-foundations in it. We don't seem to give them any coverage. Some of their stuff's very good.
Yes. This is the Green Nordic Alliance and the basically the communist parties and left parties. There are two different groups in it. One is the European Party of the Left, which I quoted in terms of its comment about the most recent treaty. And the second group are those parties who have decided not to join the European Party of the Left, which is the Portuguese, the Greek, there's a number of non-represented parties that aren't in the Parliament, that are not members, like the Irish Party, that would be kind of in that particular group. So there are two groups. They're about equal in size, I think, in terms of MEPs. I think there is quite a lot of publicity for for their positions in the Star. Maybe there could be more, but there are two quite distinct, different groups there that do overall work together within that parliamentary group, but do have distinct positions. The European Party of the Left and the other parties which are probably led by the Portuguese.